All right. Hi, everyone. And Dan Boron, thank you for the awesome introduction. And there's our slides. Perfect. So I loved that last panel because it runs perfectly into the panel discussion we're now going to have. And that's big kudos to Lindsay and her team for coordinating this all so well. So today in this session, what we're going to talk about is responding to increased project demand. So the panel that you just came from just finished talking and touching on that lightly, but Hardeep and Christopher are going to take us into a much deeper level of detail. So my name is Dan Connery. I'm the Senior Director of Product Strategy here at Trimble with a focus on owners and the public sector. Joining me today is Hardeep, who is the Director for the One Water Strategy at Miami-Dade County, and also Christopher, who is currently a senior PMIS implementation business analyst at AECOM, but he was kind enough to let me put up where he was when he retired. And what I love about Christopher's perspective is he has both a lot of experience with an individual owner, but also now with AECOM, he can bring it a point of view across a multitude of owners. And why I like having that diverse perspective is sometimes some of the challenges that folks run into are very unique to the organization they're working on. And so Christopher can bring a perspective of things that are not unique to an individual organization. I'm not going to speak any more about the panelists because I always find it's better to let them do their own introductions and their own stories. So Hardeep, over to you.
Thank you, Dan, and greetings everyone, depending on which part of the world you're joining us from. So my background is in civil engineering, focused on environmental engineering. I also got to dabble in information technology, which kind of makes me somewhat dangerous when it comes to putting systems in place. But served as a regulator for about 9 years, worked as the director of Fort Lauderdale Public Works for about 4, came back to Miami-Dade Water and Sewer to oversee a very large multi-billion-dollar capital improvement program. And most recently, the mayor has now appointed me to kind of lead up the water issues from a strategy standpoint, from a watershed standpoint. As you know, water transacts, every infrastructure that you can think of, whether it's transportation or airports and hospitals and schools. And we'll go more into detail as we speak about water crisis or infrastructure issues. But that's me.
Awesome. Thank you. And then we're going to go ahead and Christopher, hand it over to you.
Thank you, Dan. Christopher Haight. I was with the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago for 29 years. Retired from there as a managing civil engineer. I was in charge of the program management section, which basically reviewed and updated the capital improvements plan. I'm a civil engineer. Went through from being a resident engineer all the way through managing several of our large projects, including our TARP projects, the deep tunnel projects here in Chicago. So that was my former career, and then also implemented the PMIS system that we chose to replace our old one there. So all electronic for managing all of our capital programs and construction projects. And then my latest iteration of myself is as the consultant with AECOM to help other agencies and owners to find a way to transform into the digital age and improve their processes for that. So that's a little bit about me.
Awesome. Thank you. So one of the sayings I told the panelists as we were prepping for today's conversation is one of my favorite sayings is that smart people learn from their mistakes, but wise people learn from other people's mistakes. So I really, really, truly appreciate Hardeep and Christopher joining because they're going to pass along wisdom so you can learn from some of the things that they've done. Maybe you won't have to go through that learning on your own. So I just want to take a moment to set the table a little bit, and then we'll get right into I believe it's 5 topics that we're going to want to cover as a panel. I encourage you all to go ahead and ask us questions as we go along. But if not, trust me, the three of us have plenty to talk about over the time that we have available. So you heard in the prior session about the bipartisan infrastructure law. And so what this is going to do is going to create a big increase in capital spending. It's going to focus on accountability and transparency. And that transparency word is something that's very important to us here at Trimble, and trying to provide tools that provide you, hopefully our customers, to have access to the transparency that you need, but have that to be a very easy process. And then what we talk about, forcing many to do more with the same. So what I used to talk about is doing more with less. But really, this isn't necessarily talking about you having less people, but you're going to have far more work. So how do you do that more work with the same resources you have available today? And so a little bit of a high-level overview of where that infrastructure money is going to go. So big in transit and road and bridges, but also power, water, airports and harbors. And then, of course, a lot of this rolls up into city and state government. So the big part here is to understand this is incremental on top of the spending that's already available. So this is why it's do more with the same. And the one thing that we're going to dig into a little bit, and you heard Christopher use the term PMIS, which stands for Project Management Information System. But what the government as part of this legislation is talking about is Advanced Digital Construction Management Systems. So I guess ADCMS, since we all love our acronyms. But in our vernacular, it's the same thing as a PMIS system. So it's this transformation, and Christopher talked about this, how he's helping organizations through their digital transformation. And there are three main points that I want you to take away from this. One is that there is in this funding $100 million explicitly set aside to purchase the technology in order to help through the digital transformation, and specifically focused on digital construction management. It's part of the government's way of incenting people to get away from paper. And Hardeep had some great examples of the transformation that he helped lead his organization through from paper and manual processes. And we're going to talk about that later. So the biggest thing I want you to understand is you don't necessarily have to fund the procurement of these technologies as part of the funding, because there's a separate funding stream dedicated to that. Secondly, talked about this transparency. So the goal is to drive adoption and eliminate at least the cost barrier to why organizations won't transform. And then the third has to do with the transparency. So improve the asset delivery and operations of these assets. So we tend to focus, the group I work in, and specifically the product that I'm working in, is during the building of the asset. But of course, you need to design the asset, and then you need to maintain and operate the asset. So this is trying to help you focus across all those areas. So with that said, I believe we're going to have the ability to do a poll. And what we're going to ask in the first poll is what impact will the bipartisan infrastructure bill have on your upcoming capital budget? And I see the poll is already launched. So if you go back to the chat, you can go ahead, if you haven't already, fill out that response. And that'll just help give us an understanding of, are people seeing an increase, a big increase, a moderate increase, no increase, or what is this infrastructure thing you're talking about? So no idea of what you guys are talking about. All right, so with that, I'm going to shut the heck up and let our panelists start to weigh in. And so the format you're going to see moving forward is we're going to hit you with the topic. So this is how to scale your internal teams when there's a material increase in your capital improvement program budget. And the little saying down the bottom for anybody who's a fellow Peloton rider, one of the Peloton instructors talks about you can't get your body delivered to you by Amazon Prime overnight. So I stole that and said you can't order project managers via Amazon Prime, at least not yet. So it's not going to be just hit a button and they show up. So I'm going to hand this over to the panelists, and we have kind of 4 areas we're going to explore in this section. I just want to quickly share with you that we did have an owner, not to do with the infrastructure law. This was actually probably 3 years ago. It just happened to be through their own internal funding that they went from a $200 million a year capital program to a $1.4 billion. So that's a 7x increase in spending. And what I found fun about this story is they were mentioning to us that we, Trimble, had been calling on them for years. probably maybe even a decade, to get them to procure some Trimble solutions. And they were like, listen, at $200 million a year, what I built is fine. As soon as they got that funding, he called us and said, okay, it's not going to scale to that level. So I just want to tell you this is real. So now I'm going to shut up and I'm going to hand it over to Christopher and Hardeep to take us through the other 3 points. So gentlemen.
Thank you, Dan. I can jump in on this first topic first here is when talking about staffing, we all know too well, and especially lately, finding candidates, just any candidates, is becoming very difficult. So the first point would be to find ways to use your staff more efficiently. And by doing that, you can expand on your programs with existing staff while you're trying to supplement with other means, and we'll talk about that too. To do those types of things to make things more efficient, what I always find very helpful is you need to discuss with your staff what are their pain points, right? So, hey, what is it that takes up an inordinate amount of your time that we can find a different way to do, or find a more efficient way to do? What are you always, having to spend time on that? And by grabbing that information, you can find ways to make that more efficient, find ways to consolidate. Maybe you can bring in, instead of having a project engineer, maybe you can bring in a clerical staff to help on some of the clerical pieces. So finding ways to have your staff be more efficient with what their current duties are. So that's kind of what we were bringing up with that first point. Hardeep, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, so Dan, just to add to what you said, I think you hit it on the head by using the word pain point. And, coming out of the work I did at Miami-Dade Water and Sewer, but also in my former workplace, I kind of find a trend where, sometimes we know what the pain points are, but we get so busy doing our day-to-day jobs that, it's so difficult sometimes to just detach from what you're doing and kind of look at it from that lens of the customer service standpoint, right? Who's your customer? Who's your stakeholders? And frequently, at least from a governmental perspective, our stakeholders are internal stakeholders, obviously, but we also have external stakeholders, right? Contractors and vendors and other governmental agencies and permit holders. And what I've found is that, yes, you have to prepare your staff and your workforce to manage that change before change happens. But I've also found that you need someone internal as a champion. You need someone internal to the organization who broadly understands the technologies that are available and how you could minimize the use of some legacy systems, whether they're Microsoft Access or Excel or other paper-based systems, right? And I think if we bring that element of consensus building from that internal champion over time, by managing that change, I think in the long term, it is a little bit more sustainable because all of a sudden, sometimes I've also seen that, there's conversations going on to say, well, we need to become digital and we need to become paperless. And we don't prep our internal workforces sufficiently because they are the ones who are going to use these tools eventually. And it takes time. Workforce development is a big issue, like we saw in the previous presentation, 650,000 jobs, coming into the marketplace, and how well our schools and institutions are prepping those entering the workforce on the digital front is also something to be kept in mind. So yes, I think you're right on in saying get to know your pain points, get a sponsor, I think internal as a champion, and then start looking at these legacy systems and how you can retire some of these legacy systems also. Extremely critical to do that.
I absolutely agree. And trying to give a good example of the other points that we're talking about here with regards to ways that you can better utilize your existing staff as you're searching for, those additional people would be One, flexibility, talked about that. Hey, how can we change the assignments that we're giving to certain people if there's a way to off that to somebody else that was not doing that role before. The other one is use of technology. One of the pain points that we found for, and again, in my, at MWRD was one of those where we were chatting with the resident engineers, the engineers out in the field and the design engineers, and they were always talking about, hey, we have this issue in the field, and then, okay, we've got to set up a meeting, and everybody's traveling out to the meeting, and 3 or 4 days go by and everything else. And we're like, how can we do this better? Well, utilizing technology of, setting up a video conference room. So what we're able to do there is that now we've minimized 2 ways, right? One, now I can grab that internal team, those design engineers, put them in a conference room, do a video conference with the field team wherever they are. And for us, it was within an hour, but hey, you could do this, between states, and be able to look visually, especially with the advent of cell phones and cameras and everything else, be able to do at least, if not a full inspection, do that preliminary one so that right away, hey, is this something that we need to drop everything and jump out and do, or is this something that, hey, here's some direction, let's go this way, and we'll send somebody out. So those were one way. And then another one was progress meetings. Even we had engineers that were wasting 1 day a week effectively, traveling back and forth to progress meetings, doing this where they're like, hey, I don't need to do this every time. I can attend that virtually and respond the same way and document those. And we were able to save those. And so that's just one example of how you can use technology, existing technology, pretty darn easily. We've got laptops, we've got cell phones to incorporate that and find ways to get more time back, right? So now you've reduced your travel time. So that's just an example, real world that we implemented a few years ago.
And just to add a quick point to that, Chris, I think in the pre-pandemic world and the post-pandemic world, at least I had seen that, using technologies was a bit challenging, whether you want to have a quick meeting or you want to consult with a stakeholder, a consultant, or whoever it be. There used to be these face-to-face meetings, right? People come, they drive, they park, they meet you, you're running late, everybody's waiting around it. Versus now impromptu, it's become just in our nature now to set up a quick link on Zoom or any other system, and you're able to have these impromptu meetings. And I think the savings grace here is, at least in the post-pandemic world, we've all become more savvy in terms of understanding that, yes, there's a lot more to be accomplished, not only in the customer experience and the business experience of the internal and external stakeholders, the ease of use, you can be wherever you are and still conduct business, but also the fact that the openness to adoption, I think, has become much, much easier. So it's very heartening to know that there's several $100 million or $100 million set aside for businesses and institutions to adopt digital technologies. And I think, that change management thing that I was referring to will become much more easier because we've kind of adapted, unfortunately, or whichever way you see it, we've adapted to the use of digital tools, right? So I'm very optimistic about the scaling side of it.
Awesome. Good. Thank you. So we're going to move on to the next broad topic, which is how do you start the digital transformation journey? So we touched on that a little bit in the prior topic, but we'll delve into that in a little bit more detail. And so these were the 5 points that we came up with as a group. So Hardeep, why don't you go ahead and kick us off?
Sure. So, like anything new that you roll out, especially in the field of construction and construction management, there's so many different touch points. I think the first and foremost thing is to identify all of your internal stakeholders. Everyone should have a seat at the table when you kick off something like this. Of course, you have to do your homework. Otherwise, you end up becoming a victim of a round peg in a square hole syndrome. If your pain points are A, B, and C, and you're evaluating technologies X, Y, and Z, and there's no good fit or a marriage, at least by the 80-20 rule, that's a recipe for disaster right off the bat. And I think that consensus building, getting everyone on the table, also lends itself towards making sure that change is happening in like multiple dimensions, right, based on the stakeholders on the table. And then I think it's also important to make the business case, right? Because even though, let's say there's no funding, and anytime you have to make the business case of bringing a new tool, there's always this thing that comes up, oh my God, right? Yet another tool. And, amongst the plethora of tools that you have to use, whether it's for time management or financial management or a bunch of things, whether it's Microsoft Office suites, there's a lot of tools that you have to use to do your job. So I think, in that journey, I always look to see if there are opportunities to merge old systems, old or outdated systems, because you also have to make the use case to those who are going to be the decision makers on the funding side of it. So in that journey, the use case has to be backed and demonstrated with an ROI, right? And it's so difficult sometimes. If you're taking a construction management tool, we end up having subjective conversations to say, oh, you know what, we could do paperless. Oh, we could do inspections in a mobile format. But I think if we go that little step ahead, and even if it is somewhat not perfect, but at least we are able to quantify the time that it takes that we would save, and you extrapolate that time with labor dollars, and you say, you know what, historically, this is how we were doing things. Futuristically, this is what we will end up doing. And in the process, we end up saving this time. Making that use case and that journey up front will bring a lot of champions behind it in order to fund, in order to make sure you get the right funding for that process. So those would be my few pointers in the initial phase of the journey.
Awesome. And I just want to jump in for a moment because another thing to talk about, and Christopher and Hardeep touched on this, which is I think of champions and change agents as being similar. And I like Hardeep specifically called out different than the executive sponsor. So you find those people who are comfortable with change and can convince other people that this change is going to be good. So anyways, Christopher, on to the small wins.
Yeah, no, well, absolutely. And I'm kind of, there's the two sides to that. So with the small win, what we're talking about there is making sure that you have ways that people see the change quickly, right? So you don't want to have this, 6 months from now, you guys will realize the change, because that's just too long for really anybody to have to suffer through change. So I like to think of these things top down and bottom up, right? So when we're looking at the metrics, and Hardeep had touched on this before, is that, hey, let's collect the information now. How long does it take to process an RFI? If it's 15 days, 20 days, let's say, for instance. And talking to upper management, the ones that are the funding people, right? Hey, we're going to be able to crush this down. We're going to be able to lower this time amount, but you need to know what it is that you're doing now. And then look at it from, again, that pain point that we talked about before is early on. Hey, what's the pain point? What's the problem for the people actually managing the RFIs? What do you see as the problems? Hey, how can we fix this, right? You know what? I can never get a hold of the person that I'm supposed to, send this to, or hey, we're sending this via fax, via the old, heated fax machine type of thing. Whatever those pain points are, and you'll be able to address those. That way, the people with the pain points, the ones that are boots on the ground, so to speak, they're seeing that change right now. Hey, wait a minute, I'm getting my responses faster. And you have the metrics that you can show upper management, the funding people and the champions, that, hey, guess what? Here, we're seeing this benefit already. Celebrating the small wins means, hey, look what we did with this one here. Now let's jump on to the next piece. Change management is one of the large ones for every agency as far as, hey, how do we implement changes? How do we get, the additional funding and all those pieces? So that's where you want to get to eventually. But what else can we pull out of there? Hey, meetings maybe, or whatever the other pieces are that you can find. Document management is a big one. sharing documents back and forth. Hey, how can I take this full set of plans and marked up plans and give it to somebody else? Whereas before you were bringing out rolls, now electronically, hey, is there a better way to do that? So those are the types of things that you can find the metric that you're going to use, review time for a set of documents, for instance. Hey, here's what it takes now. Here's what we're going to have eventually, and build your processes, build your strategy around the pain points that you've identified and being able to show the differences or show the improvement.
So just I know you gave a couple examples, RFIs, submittals, drawing reviews, et cetera. Hardeep, any examples that you can give in your experience for small wins?
Yeah, I think on the small wins, the only different viewpoint that I can bring to the table is that sometimes when you're implementing, let's say, a large construction management tool or a system, it does take time, right? Because you're building processes in it. You're going to troubleshoot it. You're going to test it, and then it's going to go to the full scale deployment. But I think I go back to the point that the journey aspect of it is so critical that when we are even in the process of evaluating these tools, it's critical to make sure that we even bring some use cases of successes from similar organizations that might have had similar pain points, because it's always nice to hear from your counterparts in the industry, whoever that is, right? What did you do? Did you experience the same thing? How did you go about doing it? What were your lessons you've learned, similar to the conversation we're having today? And I think that would make the whole process so sustainable, because unfortunately, sometimes the whole implementation process does take time in large organizations like especially county governments, right? But on the quick wins, as soon as that happens, if we are able to, because we also have to understand that the folks who are going to be coming into this new systems, not all of them are going to be tech savvy. So being able to take the time to show them that you're taking it, for example, your inspections. The example that I would give is our inspections in the field used to be paper-based, right? You take out a small little hand notebook, a surveyor's notebook, you're writing stuff in it, then you're going back to the office, and then you're typing it in a Word document, then you're emailing it to your supervisor, and then that person's inundated with X number of Word documents. Versus, and if God forbid the supervisor's out for some reason, then it's sitting in that person's inbox, right? It's a vicious cycle if you really think about it from a construction management standpoint, especially if there's some risk elements in the report that needed to be elevated for decision making. At the tail end of it, the contractor is waiting, and time is money. So I think that entire inspection process is a great example because it automates the process. Of course, you can mitigate risk by proactively escalating it through that electronic process. And there's a slew of others. Chris mentioned about plans. We had implemented concurrent plan processing, concurrent plan reviews, where you don't have to take this in a sequential process. It goes from me, and then it goes to you, then goes to Chris, goes in a sequential process. But in a concurrent process, different faculties that are reviewing it from different lenses are able to mark up and drop. And the beauty of it is that the stakeholder, the client, whoever has submitted the drawings to you, is actually able to see this in real time, right? So because they have access to it, so they can actually in the back office make more efficient use of their staff by nibbling away at some of those, simple comments, because they don't have to wait for clarifications. And if there are some complicated comments, you can always call for one meeting, go through the complicated comments, but at least you've taken care of all of the simple ones, right? So that process itself is worth several dollars, worth showcasing to everybody, right, who's engaged in that process. So to me, that's always a big one.
Awesome. And the last thing I want to add, and then we'll move on to the next topic, is don't underestimate the change, managing that change. And what I've learned having gone through several large change initiatives is I would encourage you to let people know it's okay if they're less efficient during the change process. In fact, I would argue that if people are immediately better at doing their job, like immediately, then they're probably not on board yet. Typically, you got to learn how to use the new system. There's going to be a little bit of inefficiencies. People feel bad. Am I still good at my job? You need to encourage them through that and then tell them there'll be light at the end of the tunnel, which wraps back to the small wins. Look, we got RFIs down. I don't know, Hardeep, if you're going to share this later. If you are, you can hold it. But I know you shared with us the story about how much you took the permit or the planning review process down. Could you share that?
Sure, happy to do that. So, when I joined the organization, our capital program was in the billions of dollars, and truth be told, we were operating out of a paper-based process, from task authorizations to invoices. And I said, can do this, because we'll talk more about capacity building and efficiency building we talked about. So the first order of business for me was to become digital, right? For a ton of reasons, from efficiency to transparency, to making sure we're making timely decisions, when you're running billions and millions of dollars worth of infrastructure work. And while we were in that process of actually implementing it for the CIP side of the house, we had another side of the house which catered to the private developers. Every time, let's say, a new asset or building or infrastructure or a development is going to be undertaken, the developers have to do a few things to make sure they have capacity to address that particular development. This is like large developments, infrastructure, housing, what have you. So that might involve a private pump station, that might involve upgrading the pipes serving that particular location. So we call it private business development unit. Obviously, you can imagine Miami-Dade has a lot of that going on. And then the last thing a developer wants to be told is, well, it's going to take you X amount of time because we are kind of struggling with paper here, right? Somehow that process worked quite well. There used to be occasional complaints here and there, but one fine day when we're in the process of actually implementing the digital tools for the CIP, I get a call saying, well, this computer system that we are using, which was all paper-based, by the way, from a process standpoint, but there was one computer that we were using has crashed. And oh, by the way, it was a Pentium 5. And this is not 20 years ago. This is 4 years ago, right? And there were some jokes about it, but, there was some nervousness behind it too, to say, well, what do you mean? There's no parts for Pentium 5 anymore, maybe eBay, all those conversations were going on. But long story short, speak about adapting and becoming creative and innovative. The entire team, including the team that was implementing our tools for us, which happened to be eBuilder at that time, we changed gears and we said, what? Yes, it's important to the business, the CIP side, but can we adapt this tool for the private business development side? The answer was yes, because a project is a project, right? Doesn't matter where it is. But there was one hiccup there, and the hiccup was that there was a bunch of calculations and formulas that needed to be embedded in the tool. And believe it or not, I think the entire team innovated around it and built the entire ecosystem into that tool, so that tool not only became paperless, not only did it kind of completely transform the way we did business, but it also ended up connecting all of our external stakeholders, other cities, the contractors, the developer, the fire department, anybody who had their hands connected to it, concurrent processing. And we were in the midst of these affordable housing units, I still remember, where permits were taking a substantial amount of time because it had to be sequential, it was paper-based, and a bunch of reasons. Our time frames, Dan, reduced by orders of magnitude, from anywhere from 8 months, 6 to 8 months, to like 6 to 8 weeks, right? I'm talking of a very complicated process. So to me, that is huge, right? If you really start quantifying the pre and the post in terms of dollars, it's a slam dunk in terms of the business case. So I always like to share that story because, I think necessity is the mother of invention, as they say. and we adapted and innovated around it. The team worked really hard, but it's a huge success for the entire folks, right? Both on the software side as well as on the county side.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'm going to move us along to talking around the impact of the increased reporting requirements. So typically, if somebody's going to give you money, sometimes there's some strings attached to that money. There's some expectations around that. So this is a great article for those who want to check it out. It's on Construction Dive about Biden restoring stronger environmental review for federal projects. So just an example of some of the requirements. So if we could go ahead and talk about the impact of reporting requirements. So Christopher, over to you.
Yeah, with typical government, right? It's like I want, this ream of paper worth of documents, and for the reporting requirements, the easiest way is going to be, electronic. And I believe it's all electronic submission. I've not read it myself, but being able to track those documents and retrieve them easily, that's what you're looking for. Because chances are, if there's an environmental impact study, whatever else, you might be using that 10, 12, 15 times, however many times you might need to refer to that one document. So having that at your fingertips and easily being able to find that, it's not just in somebody's folder structure someplace on their personal computer, or however you want to organize that. That's kind of the first order of business. The number of documents that you're going to be asked to provide, again, depending on the type of project and everything else, that's the other piece of formalizing that structure, right? File structure, especially when you get into electronic documents, becomes way more important. That it's like, oh, if I just start throwing stuff in one file, suddenly you've got thousands of documents in there, and it's like, oh, gee, what did I number? What did I name this? How did I? So that becomes more important as to how you're going to organize those pieces. So thought needs to be placed in around how you're going to organize your electronic files so that they can be easily compiled, collected, and then sent out for those. The ability to share those large files, again, if you've got a large drawing set, we're talking gigabytes worth of data, you can't send that via email. Right. So having a resource that then you can post to, that somebody can get access to, gain access to, and you can have controlled access to that. That's also very important. So that's kind of those first two bullet points that we were trying to make there.
Just to add, Dan, to what Chris said is, to me, it's about transparency. To me, it's that single source of truth from a reporting standpoint, because frequently we've seen reports that are churned out from legacy systems. At least I've seen them. And you ask different people, they come up with different reports because they're using different versions of that same Excel spreadsheet that wasn't really updated, right? So then that hurts credibility of, everyone engaged in that ecosystem when that report goes out to somebody. It could be an elected official, it could be a policymaker, it could be a stakeholder, it could be a public records request. For all that matters there. So that process from a reporting standpoint and transparency is important. From a functional standpoint, anytime a project is done, there's so many stakeholders on that project, right? There's budget people, there's finance people, there's planning people because of change orders maybe. And when decisions are being made around a conference room table on a project running into millions of dollars, right? Or even smaller in size and magnitude, being able to have that 360 consistent single source of truth conversation at the same table is extremely critical, because downstream of that, all of the reporting that each one of them do and carry the messages within to their bosses, right? Whether it's money or legal or contractors conversations, I think that becomes extremely critical. And therefore, I think more than just hitting a button and getting an electronic report, the value proposition is kind of, to me, that is more important. Good. Anything, Christopher, you want to add before I move on?
Just on that, the timing aspect of being able to find information in documents. Electronic tools allow you to do detailed searches, right? So that's another reason that, hey, if you've got that 3,000 page spec book and I want to find a specific reference, you can search for it. So those, just another reason to be able to have all of that electronically and have it housed all together.
Awesome. Good. All right. So the next topic is around contractors. This was actually an area that Christopher lit me up pretty well, excited me, about thinking about contractors and when there's a supply side impact, i.e. there's lots of projects coming out. That means that contractors are going to have some choices. So I thought this was a really juicy part to dig into. So go ahead, Christopher, why don't you kick us off?
Well, the first bullet point, it boils down to money, right? Contractors and the construction industry has always pushed the financing aspect onto contractors, right? Pay when, you get paid once the installation or that piece is there. So the amount of time it takes to get their payment based upon when they submit their invoice is very critical to them. And you will see that in your bids if they know about it, right? So now that this large amount of funding is coming out and there's going to be a number of different opportunities for contractors, obviously they can't do everything. They're going to choose the agencies that they're more confident will be able to pay them on time. And also have that transparency. Hardeep had mentioned that before, is that transparency is the big thing. Hey, where is my invoice? I've submitted my invoice. Dan, has Dan reviewed that? Has our, where is it in the process? When am I getting my check? That's really what they're most interested in. And the old days of them having to call in and try to, find somebody to give them an answer. If they have an agency that has a system in place where it's transparent, they can see where that invoice is, see that it's been approved, and understand that, hey, my check is coming next Thursday, they're going to want to enter that bid, and they might even have a better price for you because they know that, hey, I'm not going to be left out 45, 90 days from when I've submitted this invoice to get my payment.
Just to add to...
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, no, go ahead, Chris. I'm sorry, you finishing.
Kind of the second piece to that would be the consistency as well. You don't want to have your project manager on project A and your project manager on project B doing things differently, right? To any major degree. Obviously, there's, personality pieces, which that's fine. But hey, if I'm submitting an invoice for contract, A, and I'm the same contractor on this contract B, I don't want to have to do two different things. So an electronic document system, a process that you set in place, if it says, hey, here's exactly what you need to do, okay, that's going to be benefit from the bidding side, also from that contractor, understanding that, hey, wait a minute, I know that regardless of who's managing the project from their side, project manager A or B or C, I know that my requirements are the same. And so that also is another thing that will garner their trust for you. So Hardeep, you had a point.
Yeah, you just hit this point on the head. And my experience has been that both on the owner side and on the contractor side, there's varied degrees of sophistication, if that's the word I can use it, in terms of process. Because it all boils down to process, right? And having a digital tool like what you said anchors that process. There's one way of doing business. There's one way of managing a project through that life cycle, from design to procure to construct to commission to close out, right? And to the degree that process is embedded clearly in the procurement documents, is embedded clearly and showcased through the contractors, large or small, then I think that relationship between the client and the owner becomes so much more successful. My experience has been that, small businesses, especially, who don't have sometimes all the resources to, educate the workforce changes quite rapidly on that side for a bunch of reasons, maybe. And one of the reasons could be, this probably is a research question, is if that contractor is not getting paid, the small contractor is not getting paid on time because the the contract says pay when paid with their prime. And if I'm an employee of that small contractor and you're not able to have liquidity in order to fund me, pay me on time, then I'm going to go and find a job somewhere else, right? As an employee. Now, what it does to the small contractor is you have to now go and hire another employee. You have to hire and train that other employee. And that's a slippery slope because that employee, again, doesn't have continuity in the business, right? So the repercussions are so huge that I think a tool, when it's implemented on the owner side, not only locks down the process, like how Chris, you said, which is critical, both for the staff who's managing the process, but also for everybody outside. But I think it's also critical that owners also take the time to not just train your internal staff, but also make sure, because now your contractors are able to connect to the system. And if they're not trained, we have a problem. So, our use case has been that we actually recorded our trainings because, we said we can't just go breathless over and over. We want to be able to give training on demand. We do this at a predetermined frequency in person. But again, post-pandemic world, digital tools are flourishing. I said, let's record it. Let's also make sure that our training is also standardized, because sometimes you're hearing different things from different people, right? So we went ahead and did that. And, we have those trainings on demand, not just for internal staff, but also for external stakeholders.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, you had touched on the subcontractors. What we found in our experience and on the training piece was when the subcontractors found out that they could get access to the system so they could track what the general contractor had been paid, they were like, oh, hey, this is great, because then they can see, hey, this was paid or this was not paid, and why not? So that added that. And then on the training piece, we found that there were a couple of contractors where after we had trained some of them, we're like, well, you need training for this new project. They're like, no, we got it. We're training all of our people internally. And so they were taking it as well. And they wanted their supply. They wanted to actually add other people into the system, because they said the more transparency, getting back to what you had said earlier, the better it was, right? Because then they can say, hey, look, you do this, and here's your line item on that schedule of values. This is what we've got for it. And they could see when that was billed and when it was paid. So again, it added that level of trust, so that the subcontractor does see, oh, yes, my portion of this invoice is on there as well. So yeah, I agree with all those. Awesome.
So with that, because we're at time, so I'm going to jump into our second poll, and oops, sorry, let me go back. Our second poll, which is what organizational challenges do you foresee as a result of increased funding for infrastructure? So Christopher and Hardeep were kind enough to share some of the things that they're running into, but would love to see what folks in the audience. So that poll will be posted. And with that, I'd like to say thank you both to Christopher and Hardeep for sharing their wisdom. Remember the beginning about difference between smart people and wise people. So thank you for sharing your wisdom. Thank you for the time. We spent quite a bit of time prepping and coming up with the talking points. So thank you both. And thank you to everyone who was listening in today and hopefully gathering some wisdom. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it back over to Daniel